These people had come to Mars to complete a simple mission, but they had absolutely no idea that in just a short while they were about to face a storm that would change their entire lives forever. The storm was so dangerous that the mission commander had to order them to abandon the mission immediately and return to Earth. As soon as they heard this, all the astronauts started running toward their rocket in a hurry. The storm had already arrived right above them, but before they could reach their rocket, suddenly a very heavy satellite antenna slammed directly into an astronaut named Mark. The moment the satellite hit him, he disappeared right in the middle of that storm. Meanwhile, the controller, sitting inside the rocket, started receiving signals that all the oxygen from Mark's suit was leaking out. His team searched desperately for him, but the storm was so terrifying that Mark was nowhere to be seen. When the rocket controller informed them about the oxygen leaking from Mark's suit, all of his teammates tried with all their strength to find him, because if all the oxygen leaked out, he would die. But due to the horrific storm, they couldn't see Mark anywhere. After searching with everything they had and still failing to find him, they assumed his oxygen had already run out and that he was dead. On the other side, their rocket was also slowly tipping over, and if it overturned, even by mistake, they could end up trapped there forever. So, helplessly, they left Mark alone there and departed for Earth. But the real story began when, a few hours later, Mark suddenly started opening his eyes because he was still alive. The problem was that now he was stranded completely alone on the entire planet Mars. Groaning in pain, Mark slowly tried to get up, because when the satellite antenna hit him, a piece of it had pierced into his body. Fortunately, the blood around the wound had clotted, which stopped the oxygen from leaking out. That was the reason he was still alive. To reduce the pain, he somehow broke off the front part of the rut. When he looked ahead, there wasn't a single sign of any human beings anywhere. All he could see was the camp where he and his teammates had been staying. He immediately understood that the others must have left the previous night. Writhing in pain, Mark somehow reached the camp. As soon as he got inside, he immediately took off his spacesuit, and the very next moment he pulled the rod out of his stomach. The pain was so intense that his scream echoed across the barren planet Mars. But the trouble wasn't over yet. A small piece of the rod was still stuck inside his body. He quickly took out the first aid box and somehow removed the remaining fragment too. But blood was still continuously flowing from the wound, so he grabbed a stapler and sealed his wound with it. The moment the staples pierced his skin, the pain shook him to his soul. Now he understood that the real game of survival on Mars was about to begin, because he was now trapped completely alone in the silent and dangerous deserts of Mars. Actually, the structure he had collided with was a communication satellite dish, and it had been completely destroyed in the storm. That meant he had absolutely no way to contact his team anymore. And even if NASA somehow received a signal that he was alive, it would still take 4 years for a rescue mission to reach Mars. Saying it sounds easy, but surviving there alone for 4 years was nothing less than a painful death. The worst part was that the camp Mark had taken shelter in was never designed for permanent survival. Slowly, all of his resources would begin running out. If the oxygen system failed even once, breathing would become impossible for him, and if he couldn't breathe, his life would end. Things were getting worse and worse for Mark. Even if the camp somehow lasted longer, the biggest issue was food supply. He didn't have enough rations to survive for 4 years until a rescue mission could reach Mars. From every angle, it seemed almost impossible for him to survive there for long. Mark began recording what felt like the final moments of his life into the computer, as if writing down his last decisions. For 2 days, the storm raging across Mars continued breaking him mentally. Every moment felt like the end. But then something inside him changed. He decided that no matter what happened, he would survive and get out of there alive. He made a plan that if a rescue mission came to Mars in the future, he would somehow stay alive until then. The problem was that the mission was still years away, and surviving that gap was the biggest challenge. Mark calculated the amount of food he had left. He discovered that even after combining all the food supplies of the crew members, he only had enough rations to survive for about 1 year. And surviving even 1 year on Mars was nothing short of a miracle. Now he could almost see death approaching him. Just as he was thinking about death, he suddenly noticed a packet of potatoes. The moment he saw it, he realized he still had a chance to survive. He decided to grow those potatoes and produce enough food to survive the remaining 3 years. But growing anything directly on the barren soil of Mars was nearly impossible, because to grow crops he needed water, and there was absolutely no water there. Now he had made up his mind. To survive, he would have to become a farmer on Mars. So he began preparing a small farm inside the camp. First, he gathered a large amount of soil in one place and slowly turned it into a farming area where crops could be planted. But the problem was that Martian soil naturally lacked the nutrients needed for plants to grow. So Mark came up with a risky plan, using the astronaut's biological waste as fertilizer. The smell was so horrifying that staying there even for a second felt like inviting death. But he had no other option. He continuously processed the material and mixed it into the soil so that the barren Martian dirt could temporarily become fertile land. He cut all the potatoes into small pieces and planted them one by one into the soil. But the next and biggest challenge was water. Fortunately, Mark had good scientific knowledge. He knew that by combining hydrogen and oxygen in a controlled reaction, water could be produced. He also had all the necessary equipment for the experiment. But during his first attempt, he made a major mistake. He failed to properly calculate the oxygen already present in the camp, which was constantly decreasing because he was breathing it. The moment he mixed oxygen and hydrogen, a massive explosion shook the entire area. Mark survived, but he understood that even the smallest mistake on us could cost him his life. The next day, he started again. This time, he worked carefully and intelligently, and the experiment succeeded. Slowly, moisture started forming, and finally water began being produced on the barren land of Mars. It was enough for the soil where Mark had planted the potatoes. A few days later, when the first green plant emerged from the soil, his happiness knew no bounds. Meanwhile, back on Earth, NASA officially announced that Mark Watney was dead. The news spread rapidly across the entire world, and everyone began considering him a lost astronaut. They even held his funeral. The next day, at NASA headquarters, an analyst named Vincent told the director that they should redirect the satellite toward the Ares 3 mission area and scan it again. But NASA management rejected the idea. Their fear was that if the cameras captured Mark's dead body, those images could spread worldwide, and public trust in NASA might collapse. But Vincent wasn't someone who gave up easily. He secretly sent the exact coordinates of the Ares 3 landing zone to the satellite team, so they could closely inspect the area again. When Mindy, the satellite operations expert, focused the cameras there, she was shocked. Some mission equipment was no longer in its original place. Certain things had clearly been moved. The most surprising part was that the rover had also moved from its position, the same rover used to transport equipment. On a deserted planet like Mars, equipment moving by itself was impossible. The moment she saw this, Mindy realized Mark Watney was still alive. She immediately called Vincent and explained everything. Hearing this, Vincent was stunned too. He immediately informed NASA Director Alex. At first, the director tried ignoring the possibility, saying the storm might have shifted the equipment. But Vincent confidently replied that this could not happen on its own and that he was 100% sure Mark was alive. Finally, the director accepted the truth. Now, NASA faced a new crisis because they had already told the entire world that Mark was dead. They had even held to his memorial. Revealing the truth now could become extremely risky for NASA. After much discussion, they decided to tell the media everything. However, they still chose not to inform the other crew members returning to Earth. NASA feared that if the crew found out Mark was alive and that they had left him behind, they might do something reckless out of guilt. Meanwhile, on Mars, 70 days had already passed for Mark living alone. By now, he had solved his food and water problems, but now the biggest question was, how would he ever leave Mars? Mark knew that NASA's next mission, Ares 4, would land near Schiaparelli crater a few years later. But there was still one massive problem. That location was thousands of kilometers away from where he currently was. If he wanted to survive, he somehow had to reach that place. Mark estimated through calculations that the dangerous journey could take nearly 60 days. The mission seemed almost impossible, but he had no other option. So he immediately began preparing. He had a rover that wasn't functioning properly, but Mark wasn't just an astronaut. He was also a brilliant engineer. He removed some functioning parts from the damaged rover and installed them into another one. After a long repair process, he upgraded the rover enough to reach the future Ares 4 landing site. Now, his next challenge wasn't just survival, it was crossing the entire planet Mars. When he left his camp and headed toward the destination, the nighttime temperatures on Mars dropped so low that a human could freeze within minutes. If he didn't solve that issue, he wouldn't survive even 1 day, let alone 60. Then another dangerous idea came to him. When his team had first arrived on Mars, they had buried a nuclear power source underground so it could safely provide energy. The device was extremely powerful, but if it got damaged even slightly, the radiation leaking from it could cause a horrific death. The risk was enormous, but Mark had no other choice. He dug the battery out of the ground and attached it to his rover. Now, the heat generated by the power source protected the rover from the freezing temperatures, allowing him to continue his journey. Meanwhile, on Earth, NASA was also doing everything possible to save Mark. They ordered the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to prepare an emergency mission, a probe capable of delivering supplies to Mars. The problem was that such spacecraft normally took months, sometimes even a year, to prepare. But now they had very little time. NASA's entire rescue plan depended on this mission. Their idea was to send enough food supplies to Mark so he could stay alive on Mars until the next mission arrived. Then, when Ares 4 landed on Mars in the future, its crew would bring Mark back to Earth with them. The mission sounded simple, but in reality, it was nearly impossible. The JPL team worked day and night because they had to prepare a fully functional supply probe in an incredibly short amount of time. At the same time, NASA Administrator James gave Mindy another responsibility. She now had full control over the satellites and monitoring systems, so she could track every movement Mark made on Mars. People on Earth believed he was dead, but in reality, all of NASA was watching his every breath. Meanwhile, on Mars, Mark finally began seeing the results of his hard work. All the potatoes he had planted were now fully grown. Seeing greenery on the red Martian soil filled him with joy. He harvested nearly 600 potatoes. Mark separated the larger potatoes for food and replanted the smaller ones into the soil so farming could continue longer. By using his intelligence, he had secured his future food supply even on barren land. At least now he no longer feared dying of hunger. But deep inside, one thing still tormented him. If he could never contact NASA, surviving all these days could become meaningless. He could still die there. On a deserted planet like Mars, finding a communication system was almost impossible. But Mark wasn't someone who gave up. After thinking deeply, he came up with an idea. Without wasting time, he got into his rover and headed toward a dangerous location nearly 60 days away from his camp. Back on Earth, every movement he made was being monitored through satellites. Mindy and Vincent were shocked. They couldn't understand why Mark was leaving the camp and traveling so far away. Days passed, and Mark kept moving steadily in one direction. His most dangerous journey across the barren lands of Mars continued for many days. As he kept moving forward, fear inside NASA grew stronger. No one could understand what Mark was trying to do. Then, suddenly, Vincent remembered something. He immediately mapped Mark's route on the Mars map and realized Mark was heading toward an old Mars probe called Pathfinder. It was the same robotic lander NASA had sent to Mars years earlier to collect data about the soil. The mission had initially succeeded, but years later its battery died, and communication with Earth was permanently lost. Since then, Pathfinder had remained buried somewhere in the Martian soil. That's why Mark was going there, because Pathfinder was his only chance to contact NASA. After a long search, Mark finally found Pathfinder buried beneath the Martian soil. Vincent's guess had been absolutely correct, but another challenge still remained. Communication would only be possible if NASA still had the same model of the system back on Earth. Without wasting time, Vincent rushed to JPL in California, because now this years-old technology had become the only connection between Mark and Earth. Fortunately, JPL still had a preserved model of Pathfinder. Vincent immediately gathered several scientists who had worked on the original Pathfinder mission years earlier. Now, the real game had begun for Vincent, but whether he would be able to save Mark or not would only be known later. Meanwhile, on Mars, Mark removed Pathfinder's dead battery and connected it to his camp's power source. The moment he connected it, fortunately, it started working again. As soon as he turned Pathfinder's antenna toward Earth, NASA's old model at JPL immediately received a signal. The entire team was overwhelmed with joy. A spacecraft that had lost contact years ago was working again. When a team member began sending commands to Pathfinder and activated its camera, Mark immediately understood that NASA was trying to contact him. He quickly grabbed a board and wrote, "Are you receiving me?" Then he drew yes and no options on both sides of the board so they could reply simply by moving the camera. As soon as the JPL team saw the question, they rotated the camera toward yes. Seeing the camera move on Mars reignited hope inside Mark. For the first time in so many days, he felt that he truly wasn't alone anymore. But communication between Mars and Earth was still extremely slow and difficult. The distance between the planets was so enormous that even a simple question and answer took nearly 4 hours. And the biggest issue was that only Mark could ask questions. For now, only in yes or no form. NASA couldn't directly send